Hey everyone, in this video I want to dive into a brand new way to get our accounts from on-premises replicated and synchronized into Azure AD, the new Azure AD Cloud Sync that has just gone GA. But first, as always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment and share would definitely be appreciated. So if we take a step back, we're all used to the idea that, hey, we have an existing Active Directory. And this might be a single domain. It might be I have multiple domains in a tree. It might be I have different namespaces. So I have a forest, maybe even multiple forests. And that's great for things on premises. But when you start looking at, hey, I have some cloud services, this can be kind of problematic to use. It talks things like Kerberos and NTLM that are really not very friendly for cloud-based services. So we have things like SAML and WS-Fed, but I have to maintain a whole federation infrastructure. So then we have our Azure AD tenant. So for our organization, we have our instance of Azure AD. Of course, down here we have our AD. And Azure AD speaks cloud. OAuth 2, AAD Connect, SAML, WS-Fed. So all these different cloud services can now easily just integrate with Azure AD. And things like obviously Azure and Microsoft 365 all kind of natively trust an Azure AD instance. That's how they do their authentication. But I don't want islands of authentication. I don't want to think about, hey, I have an account here and I have to maintain a completely separate account up there. So what historically, and even today, we run something on-prem. We run an engine. And this is Azure AD Connect. Now, there's been different versions. There was DirSync, Directory Sync Tool. There's a whole number of different things. And I say it runs on-prem. My point is it runs in an infrastructure I maintain. It could run as a virtual machine in Azure, but it's something I have to run. And this engine is all built off of kind of identity manager. There's a whole metaverse where we join objects together. Then we have kind of this connector space to AD, and then a connector space to Azure AD. And it's primarily focused on synchronizing that way. There's a few types of things that it will synchronize the other way, but it's really all focused around AD to Azure AD. And the way this works is it has to have, I can only have one instance of Azure AD Connect talking to an Azure AD instance. So if I had multiple forests, for example, well, this instance has to be able to have line of sight. It has to have a network communication to it. If I had a disconnected air-gapped scenario, it doesn't work. I can't do those. So merger and acquisition, this can actually be fairly painful. Also, as I start to get very large, I think it's kind of when you get past 100,000 objects, then I have to have things like, well, I need a separate SQL server to actually talk to Azure AD Connect because the kind of SQLite you get with it has a size limit. Now, this thing is kind of replicating at a 30-minute interval. You can change that. So that's for the usual objects. And then there's kind of the password hash of the hash is on a 2-minute interval, which you can't change. So that's what we have today. And again, the challenge of this is there's this one instance for the entire Azure AD. I might have to maintain things like SQL Server if I have a big environment. I can run a second instance in kind of a staging mode. So I could think, well, I could have another one kind of here that does the imports and the synchronization, but doesn't do any exports. It doesn't change anything on the outside world. So I could technically flip over if I really had to. And if you're really interested in detail around Azure AD Connect and this piece, click up there. I did kind of a deep dive into understanding the links between the objects. So that's what we had, this engine that I have to run, that I have to maintain. And it does a great job. But maybe I want a simpler solution. I want less that I have to actually manage. And so now what we're moving to is this Azure AD Cloud Sync. And we can kind of think about it, there's still an engine, but really the engine now is moving up into Azure AD. So you can kind of think we have this new Cloud Sync actually running up here. Now, it's not the same engine. It's not just moving Azure AD Connect up there. It's completely different architecture. There's no metaverse in the cloud, for example. And what this is based on now for this new Azure AD Cloud Sync, I deploy a very, very lightweight agent to every domain. So here I could think about if I kind of drew out a domain hierarchy again, maybe I've just got one tree, one contiguous namespace. I would have at least one agent in every domain. But it could support a completely disconnected scenario. There's an air gap between these. Hey, I could install the agent there as well. That's going to work just fine. And the way this actually works is you can kind of think about in Azure, there's this hybrid identity service. And this is all built off of Service Bus. Now, this might seem familiar. This Service Bus is exactly the same thing that's used for things like Azure AD App Proxy, parcel authentication. Remember, Service Bus is the Azure Enterprise Message Broker Service. I can essentially have messages broken down into these various queues with things like topics. I can control all of these things. And so what's happening here is it's using this same hybrid identity service that used for other things, this HIS, and these establish an outbound connection to it. So this is all 443. There is another port, so if there's a problem, if I can't get to 443, I think it's 8080 for the 10-minute kind of check-in process. So that is there as well. But essentially now I run this super lightweight agent on each of the domains. Now, it's not recommended to install it on domain controllers, but I can if I wanted to. I want to install it on the same level of security as a domain controller would be. So if my domain controller I think about as a tier 0 workload, I would install these agents again on a tier 0 type of machine. Now I can have multiple of these agents for resiliency purposes, eventually for kind of throughput. So I can actually deploy multiple in the same domain. I don't mean to draw a strange kind of face. And again, they would all kind of connect in. Today it will be active passive, but I think there's definitely a movement to just be active active. So they could kind of spread the workload, have kind of that whole resiliency thing. So I'm going to save a number of things here. No matter what the size, I still just run this kind of lightweight agent. I'm never deploying SQL Server. It's got a much lower overhead. There's less to manage than this fairly big Azure AD Connect thing. It's a very, very simple setup. It's literally kind of a click, 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 and I'll walk through some of this in a second. But another key point is this agent is not just used for this new Azure AD Cloud Sync. This is the same agent we actually use for things like the HR scenarios. So remember, we can have things like a HR system, like Workday, for example, and they can kind of talk to Azure AD to provision accounts. Well, actually that goes through this same process to create it on-prem and then send it back up. If I actually go and look for a second, this is kind of the first screen of this Azure AD Connect provisioning agent wizard. It actually tells me what this agent does. And you can see here the agent is, yes, it's the Azure AD Cloud Sync to synchronize identities from on-prem to Azure AD, but it's also to provision identities from the cloud HR systems to the on-premises AD. So this solution, this agent we're using, they're trying to move away from a ton of different agents. So this one agent, yes, it uses to provision upwards this way, but it's also the same agent that's going to take the request, create the account, and then synchronize it up into Azure AD, how the HR integrations actually work. Remember, I had this 30-minute interval here. I could change that. In Azure AD Connect, I can change it. So here, what's actually cool is this interval is now 2 minutes for kind of users and groups, and then a separate 2 minutes for kind of those password hash of the hash. Remember, it doesn't send the password hash, it sends the hash of the hash, same as what this does. It's kind of a hash of the hash. And we can actually see that. So if I jump over and look at my environment, So here I've actually got this up and running. So I can go and look at my Azure AD Connect. And we can see here we have this Azure AD Cloud Sync. If I select my Azure AD Cloud Sync, I can see my various configurations. So I have this up and running. If I click the status, which here it kind of shows me is this healthy, I'll see two jobs. Notice we see this user and group sync job that last processed a couple of minutes ago. And I also see the password hash sync job. So there are two separate jobs running on this that actually drive all of the configuration. And what's nice about this is this agent that we're using here will auto update. I don't have to kind of do anything. When you install this thing, it actually sets up kind of two services on the box. One of them is the kind of the provisioning agent. One is actually kind of this auto update. So I don't have to do anything around this. Now, in terms of the deployment of this thing, it can absolutely coexist with Azure AD Connect. I have it in my environment. So you could think about, hey, I'm using Azure AD Connect already. Great. Now I've done this merger and acquisition. It's a disconnected air-gapped scenario. So I can't use Azure AD Connect to replicate it. Well, hey, I could use Azure AD Cloud Sync to actually use this thing. If I want to pilot it, which is what I did in my environment, I can't have Azure AD Connect and Azure AD Cloud Sync sending the same object. Like my user account could not sync through Azure AD Connect and through Cloud Sync. It's going to break things. But what I absolutely can do is, like the old Azure AD Connect, there were some advanced scenarios where I could have one OU going to one Azure AD, then a different Azure AD Connect sending a different OU to another Azure AD. So if I think about my Active Directory domain, it's not really just this flat structure. I have a whole set of organizational units, and sometimes those might be nested, etc. So what I could absolutely do, and this is kind of what the pilot documentation talks you through, I could have Azure AD Connect replicating my Azure AD except for, actually I'll change that color, except for that OU. Don't replicate that OU Azure AD Connect, but you can do everything else. And then I can also set up Azure AD Cloud Sync, so I deploy the little lightweight agent in the same domain. And in this one, its configuration says only send that OU. So now they're not conflicting. They're doing two really different sets of objects. It's the same domain, but they're not doing the same thing. And that's exactly what I have in my configuration. So I configured my Azure AD Connect to exclude a cloudy OU, both inbound and outbound. And then if you actually look at my configuration, so what you do is you add agents. So I've got agents, you download this very small agent, you execute it, you sign in. Again, I'll walk through that in a second. Then you add a configuration. So in my configuration, what I actually did here is I simply said, hey, I want to go to my Active Directory domain is salvatech.net. And then I have a scoping filter. So I limited my scoping filter to the OU just cloudy in my salvatech.net. So it's the distinguished name. And again, that's the same OU that I blocked for Azure AD Connect. And the pilot documentation, if you want to play around with this, talks through this exact scenario. And I'll include the links in the description below if you want to go and kind of try this for yourself. So there's a whole bunch of different scenarios now that I can actually do with this because they can coexist. Now remember, for every domain, I have to have the agent deployed to. There's no concept of this single doing everything in a forest. I will deploy it to all of them. I can absolutely have multiple ones to get that resiliency. Again, it's active passive today, but I think that's going to kind of change in the future. We do have this fast synchronization. So again, Azure AD Connect by default is 30 minutes for regular objects. This is 2. I can do an on-demand sync, actually, if I really wanted to. If we go back to the portal, and as part of the configuration, there's kind of a test you can do. Well, I can use that test, this validate here. So in this step 3, if I wanted to do an urgent kind of replication of a user, I don't even want to wait 2 minutes. I can say provision a user and just type in the distinguished name of the AD user. Because all of these agents on premises are essentially connected to this hybrid identity service, this service bus. They're constantly connected, waiting to be instructed. And it's this that drives the every 2-minute thing. So it can absolutely do things outside of that. So when I click that to do this kind of on demand, it will tell it straight away, hey, go and replicate this user. It will go and grab it and kind of send that thing up. So I can even do a kind of on demand if I really, really want to. So this is the idea behind it. As you can see, I can pilot and have them coexisting what I've got in my environment right now. So what do you actually need to do this thing? So if we look at kind of the prerequisites first. So let's jump over. Now I'm not going to go through this again. I've got the links below. But to actually install it in a domain, I have to be a domain admin or an enterprise admin. Because what that's going to do is create this group managed service account. Now remember, a group managed service account, the beauty of this thing is it's an account that the machines that are allowed to use it can automatically kind of rotate the password. So don't get stuck into this hideous thing that I've got this service account whose password never changes. And what we like about a group managed service account is I could have multiple machines, i.e. all of those agents in the same domain using the same group managed service account. So we're going to get a group managed service account created in every domain that all of the agents can kind of share. Now it's going to create that for you automatically. If you want, and what I did is I actually manually created mine. Now it's going to try and create it in the managed service account container by default. So that's where it's going to create it if you let it create it. What I did, and you see this little script behind me, make this a bit bigger, I just picked my own name, AAD Cloud Sync. I only have one agent, so I've only allowed one machine to be allowed to use it. And I just created this group managed service account. And I can actually see that. If I look at my AD, there it is. I created it just in my service accounts OU. So that is that group managed service account that my agents are actually going to use. And this is the box I actually installed it on, which while I'm here, we can also see the two services it actually sets up. So you can see this Azure AD Connect agent updater and the Azure AD Connect provisioning agents. So I have to have that domain or enterprise admin account to be able to create the group managed service account. Then for my Azure AD, now it's saying this hybrid identity administrator, that's basically a reduced privilege account, or it can be a global admin. So it's one of those two things will actually let me then actually do the connection to Azure AD, lets me kind of create the certificate it's going to use for the authentication. So you have a choice. If you're a global admin, it's going to work fine. If you have a reduced set of privileges, I need that hybrid identity administrator role. Then it's just saying what you need for the server. Hey, 2012 R2 later. Again, should be a tier 0. Again, it's dealing with identity. And then it goes through all of the other configurations, etc. you need. There's things like you need the AD PowerShell present, but just read through that. And then the actual install, I mean, it's really complete no-brainer. You literally just give it the two accounts. You download it from the portal. So if we go back over here, you can do download agent. So I download the agent. And then literally, as you can kind of see, I've got this running over here. You would click next through and you enter the Azure AD account, that global admin or the hybrid identity manager. You select an existing group managed service account, or it's going to create one. It connects to Azure AD using that global admin or hybrid identity administrator. And that's literally it. You don't do anything else on that side. So it does all of those things. You can see it walks through. So I'm not going to go in detail, just follow the document. It's very well documented. And then once that's done, you just add the Cloud Sync configuration. So as I showed you from the portal, you go in, you add where you want to sync. You can restrict it to certain OUs, which is exactly what I have here in this configuration. And really you're done. I mean, that's it. There's some attribute mapping you can do. Make sure you set it as enabled. You can prevent accidental deletions. You can set a notification email for things. One of the cool things is logging is just built in. So I'm going to look at the logs. And here, I'll change it to the last 7 days. You can see where I set this up. So I set this up on that cloudy. And I can see, well, on the cloudy, hey, look, I created a cloudy user. Was created in Azure AD. Its name was Cloudy Clouderson. Fantastic naming, obviously. But then later on, you can see it kind of, hey, it modified it. It did a bunch of other things. But I can see everything it's doing really around this. And again, as I mentioned, you can do that on demand if you've got this urgent, I can't even wait 2 minutes, or just for the testing, via that configuration and that step 3 that lets me enter that distinguished name. So this is really where it is today. Again, it's GA now. It's available. So then the question may be, well, what do I use? Do I carry on using Azure AD Connect, which is great, and I don't think it's going away. I don't think it's going anywhere. It's still choice. Do I want to run the engine? Because there's more, because I am running the engine, I can do more advanced scenarios. I can actually go in and modify all the rules it's using. I can do different things. This is purely managed. Now, if I'm new to this, this is probably going to be the direction I'm going to want to go. There are a few caveats. Today, Cloud Sync does the hash of the hash replication for you. Fantastic. But if you use Azure AD domain services, that's where it actually creates a set of managed domain controllers and then replicates accounts from Azure AD to AD. Well, to do that, it has to send not only the hash of the hash, but the original password hash, which it then sends into the managed domain controllers. This does not support that today. So if I want to use Azure AD domain services, I cannot use this Azure AD Cloud Sync. We actually have a full comparison document. So if we scroll down this kind of what is Azure AD Cloud Sync, it talks through the features. So once again, we can kind of see some of the benefits of Cloud Sync is this connect to multiple disconnected AD forests. It's a lightweight agent. I can have multiple active agents. Remember, Azure AD Connect can have a staging mode, but it's not active. It's just kind of sitting there. I can switch it over. It's doing no exports. Now we can see here, for example, the Cloud Sync can't connect to LDAP directories, whereas Connect can. It does not support device objects. It doesn't support things like Exchange Writeback. It doesn't support customer-defined AD attributes, which we can kind of see over here. It doesn't support pass-through authentication. If we keep scrolling down, filter on objects, attributes, values, it doesn't do. But then you get into all these advanced attribute customizations, writeback. It does not do so password writeback. It cannot do Azure AD domain services exchange hybrid. So none of those things will work with this Azure AD Cloud Sync today. But notice it does have on-demand provisioning, as I showed. Now the long-term goal for this thing is, I think it will get parity. So again, this is the GA, but it's the initial GA of this Azure AD Cloud Sync. So as a company, you really need to go and look at, well, what features am I using? I can go and look at that chart and work out what is the right solution for me. But if you want to just start playing with it, the pilot documentation, again, I've got the link below. You could set up what I did. So again, I have both of these running. You can see on my domain, if you look, you can see it talks about both Azure AD Connect. So you can see my Azure AD Connect sync is still running, sync less than an hour ago, and I've got my Azure AD Cloud Sync running. And again, it's still going to work, things like seamless sign-on is still going to work exactly the same way. You're not going to have any problems there. So if you want to pilot it, sort of play around, you could pick a certain OU, block it for users, groups, etc. from going via Azure AD Connect, and then only enable that for the Azure AD Cloud Sync. So this is this kind of first step in moving the engine up into Azure AD. So there's less for me to have to run, less for me to have to worry about. Again, the agent's going to automatically update. But Azure AD Connect is not going anywhere. it's there. It's not this wrong. Again, there's those more advanced scenarios today that only it can handle. But I would definitely advise going and looking at it. Again, it's the same agent that it uses for things like that HR provisioning. And it's using that same hybrid ID service, identity service, that password authentication uses, Azure AD Proxy uses. So they're really trying to reduce the number of agents and services that are running in the environment. But I love this kind of 2-minute user and group, that on-demand provisioning, and really just less for me to manage, less for me to worry about having this great big engine that I kind of have to run. Now I just run these lightweight agents that are really no configuration, and it's all just managed by the cloud. So that's it. I hope this was useful. Go check it out. Till next time, take care.